Hey there, this is Dr. Maria Helt with Osada Natural Health here in southwestern Colorado, and I decided to throw together a video today after some unexpected mushroom foraging this morning. So overall, it's been a pretty crappy season for me here in the San Juan Mountains, and I haven't had a lot of luck finding many mushrooms, a couple of small boletes, and that's about it. There's Milo, my ever-present companion in the background. And so I was out this morning taking Milo on his walk, and lo and behold, I came across Shaggy manes. So here are some little ones growing. And so I was pretty excited about this. Who knew that my foraging this year would be limited to the area around the parking lot where I live? And so Shaggy mane is one of many different types of mushrooms, kind of generally referred to as Inky Caps. Let's get him in the picture a little more, sleeping in the background. Lawyer's wig is another name for this particular mushroom. And they show up around here in the San Juans in the summer and into the fall, generally with cooler weather, and it has been a bit cooler of late compared to earlier. And so the genus, the botanical name rather, is Coprinus comatus. Coprinus is the genus name, and then comatus, Comatus. So Shaggy mane, lawyer's wig, a variety of other names. And so this is a mushroom that's commonly found in lawns, along roadways. So I will often see this up behind Perg along the forest roads there, although it's really dusty and not a great place to pick them. Along parking lots, which is where I found this one, kind of stuffed back in a corner. And so these are saprophytic mushrooms, which means they will grow on dead, decaying organic matter. They don't need to grow in association with the roots of a tree, for instance, like we see with other types of mushrooms like chanterelles that have mycorrhizal associations. This is a saprophyte, kind of like the ubiquitous button mushroom you see in the grocery store that is cultivated on manure. Now, these can get quite large. As I've said, I've seen really big shaggy manes up behind Perg. The ones I found were really young baby ones. And despite their size, these are actually pretty delicate mushrooms, which if you've ever handled them, you have to be really careful or they fall apart. And so the cap starts out cylindrical when it's younger. Here you go. And the stalk itself is white and hollow. So here's a cross section of a stalk. So it's hollow, almost looks like a straw. And the gills actually will start out light colored and then eventually, sorry, the lighting is so bad. So here's a cross section of the mushroom cut along the y-axis. And the gills will start off light colored. Maybe this little baby one is a better way to see. This is cut across the x-axis. And so you can see the light-colored gills, but eventually they will start to get dark. And indeed, the spores of this mushroom are black. And so one of the interesting things about this mushroom is that it liquefies when the spores mature. Deliquescence, which is one of my favorite words as of recent times. And so the mushroom will actually liquefy. And if you pick it and are walking around for too long with it in your bag, it's going to turn to liquid. If you pick it and try to store it in your fridge overnight and deal with it the next day, it'll turn to liquid, as I've discovered on my own. And so generally the liquefaction will just happen on its own as the mushroom ages and matures and the spores are mature. So it turns black, hence the name Inky Cap. And in fact, that black goo has been used as ink. Now, this mushroom has been used medicinally in various parts of the world. For instance, in China, this particular species has been used for digestive support and to treat hemorrhoids, otherwise known as piles in old-fashioned language. And there are a number of research studies looking at the effects of this mushroom. Now, most of these studies are either in rodents or in petri dishes, cell culture, in vitro, meaning test tube studies. So I haven't stumbled across any modern clinical trials with the mushroom. Doesn't mean that they're not out there, but I haven't seen them yet. But there are some interesting properties coming out of these studies. So for instance, in cell culture with prostate cancer cells, extracts of this mushroom have been found to inhibit the growth, or the proliferation more accurately, of these cells, and through various mechanisms. And so there appears to be interference with androgen receptor activation on these prostate cancer cells. So androgens, especially dihydrotestosterone, which is an aggressive form of testosterone, stimulate the growth of these cancer cells. And by interfering with androgen receptor activity on the cell, it prevents the activation of cell division by male sex hormones, especially dihydrotestosterone. And so some of the molecular studies looking at this have found that components of the mushroom block the binding of androgens to the androgen receptor genes let me backtrack. The mushroom components block the binding of the androgen receptor to the genes that it activates in the nucleus of the cell. So doing a little doing a little biology here. What happens with androgen receptor on the cell surface is that androgens bind to it and activate it, and it goes inside and activates transcription of genes. So that process is inhibited by mushroom extracts of this mushroom. And also reduced levels of androgen receptors on the surface of the cell have also been observed following treatment with these mushrooms. So really interesting potential maybe for inhibiting the growth of prostate cancer. But again, these are studies in cancer cells in a dish that they're hopeful, but they don't necessarily translate to what's going on in the body. For instance, if we were to eat this mushroom, how does that affect the mushroom chemicals that are actually making it to the prostate, just as an example there. But it's interesting nonetheless. Also, extracts of this mushroom and various components of the mushroom have been found to kill cancer cells of other types as well in a dish, including ovarian cancer cells, inducing apoptosis, or so-called programmed cell death of those cells. It's really cool to look at apoptosis under a microscope, by the way. The cell just kind of blebs out and looks like it kind of explodes. Anyway, these are experiments done in a dish, which aren't always translatable to what happens in us, but are still interesting and are a jumping off point for further research. Now, there are other studies done in rodents showing that this mushroom, in fact, has liver protective properties, and I'll come back to the liver in a bit. There's some interesting stuff with other species of inky caps and that are not necessarily so great. And then other studies in rodents have shown hypoglycemic activity, or blood sugar reducing activity of this mushroom, especially polysaccharide fractions. And in vitro, so in test tube studies, it's been found that the mushroom can inhibit an enzyme known as alpha amylase and another enzyme known as alpha glucosidase that are involved in starch and sugar digestion. And the activity of these enzymes basically speeds the breakdown of the carbs we eat and increases our blood sugar levels. So when you can decrease the activity of these enzymes, it can slow down the release of blood sugar in the body, which is useful for diabetics. And again, these are rodent studies and studies in test tubes. I believe there are some really old studies from multiple decades ago looking at actual diabetics, but I've not been able to get those studies to read them. I've not been able to access them. But a number of mushrooms do have hypoglycemic activity, and this appears to be one of them. Now, like a lot of mushrooms, shaggy manes have immunomodulating activity and antioxidant activity and antimicrobial activity, and these are all properties shared by all edible mushrooms, edible and medicinal mushrooms. And then finally, one weird kind of study that I saw is that the mushroom is being used in industrial processes to improve the yield of certain medicinal components of ginkgo biloba. So in terms of ginkgo, it is an herb that's commonly used as a standardized extract. And as an herbalist, I think a lot of standardized extracts are kind of bullshit. It's a way to pharmaceuticalize plant extracts when there are in fact many different active components in a lot of medicinal plants. But ginkgo actually is one example where standardized extracts have been found to be useful. That said, in this particular study, the authors were looking at mass producing just one component of ginkgo, and so again, as an herbalist, I'm not interested in the drugification of the herbs that I use. But anyway, the mushroom through fermentation processes has been found to improve the yield of particular ginkgo components. So from a chemistry standpoint, it's kind of cool. And if you own a nutraceutical company, I suppose. Now, eating it, finally, last but not least. This is an edible mushroom. Again, here's the outside, here's the inside. You should always know what the hell you are harvesting before you put it in your mouth so that you don't make a mistake. There are lookalikes that are actually quite poisonous in Colorado to this mushroom. So know your mushrooms. Go on some forays, get lots of books, watch lots of videos, join your local mycological society. But anyway, this one's actually cultivated in Asia as edible, as an edible mushroom. Typically, it's the young ones that are eaten, the little ones that are eaten before they liquefy. So there's that hollow stalk again inside the cap. If you wait too long or if it's too old, it will be goo, mushy. And some people actually do use that black goo in food, for instance, as part of pasta dough. So you don't need squid ink, you could just use Inky Caps. But the nutritional value does decrease when the mushrooms mature and get all nasty. And frankly, they're not very appetizing looking when they get into the ink stage. So don't wait to cook it either, even if you're harvesting it and it seems somewhat firm and young and happy. Even sticking it in the fridge overnight, like I've said, it can turn to mush the next day, as I've found out, much to my chagrin. This mushroom, like many mushrooms, is quite nutritious, and some studies have found about 25% protein per dry weight. The mushroom, so it's a good, pretty high protein vegetarian source of food. It also contains appreciable quantities of linoleic acid, a fatty acid. Now, in terms of potential toxicity, there are other species in the genus Coprinus that contain a heat-stable compound called coprine, C-O-P-R-I-N-E, and a species of Inky Cap, Coprinus atramentarius. Actually, that name's recently changed to atramentaria, and I'm probably butchering the Latin because I'm not a Latin expert, nor am I a botanist. I'm an herbalist. Anyway, that one definitely contains appreciable levels of coprine, which will make you very sick if you consume the mushroom with alcohol, and it can be eating the mushroom within 3 hours to 3 days of having alcohol. So say I ate one of these mushrooms for breakfast today, and then later on I had wine with my friend, which I actually plan on doing, or in a couple of days I have wine or beer, I can get really sick. Now, depending on the reference you look at, Coprinus, or Shaggy mane, Coprinus comatus, sorry, I haven't had coffee today, does not contain coprine, but other references state that it does. Most of the references I've seen says that it does not. Some references that I've seen says it has low levels. And so this coprine that causes alcohol toxicity actually has an impact on ethanol metabolism. That's how it makes you sick, and you wind up accumulating a chemical known as acetaldehyde in your serum, and you get sick. And you can have nausea, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, dizziness. The symptoms can be pretty nasty. They generally resolve after about 6 hours or so. But the disagreement out there in the literature on whether this particular shaggy mane has coprine in it is enough to make me not eat it this morning, since I know I'm going to have alcohol tonight. Just in case, there are multiple references showing no content of coprine in this mushroom, but I'm just being careful. And then, as I mentioned, there are dangerous lookalikes of this mushroom, especially in Colorado, a chlorophyllum species that has similar shaggy appearance, though the caps tend to be rounder, not quite so cylindrical shaped, and the stalk interior will turn a reddish brown when cut, unlike this white one The toxic mushroom will have a greenish spore print. It won't have black spores like this. So again, it just brings back the point of knowing what you are harvesting. So I am in fact going to go cook this mushroom and then save it for when I'm not drinking, just in case. Just in case. Most of the studies I've seen have not found coprin in it, but just in case there's any there, I'd like to spare myself some tachycardia. So there you go, kind of an impromptu video on a very common mushroom here in Colorado, but actually in many parts of the world. Shaggy mane, Coprinus comatus. So be well, and thanks for tuning in.